Good, then we'll go on. And before we go on to this and try to make sense of what's going on here, I do want to just point you in a couple of other directions with regards to the first half of class, just because we talked primarily about Rauschenberg. I did want to point out one more work of Jasper Johns because you saw it at MoCA, our trip to MoCA last week, 2 weeks ago, whenever that was. You saw two of John's work, and one of them was this, the map. And once again, he's just importing common visual structures from the culture. They're already laden with associations, and using that as a structure for making an abstract painting, abstract. But he does so in a way that they don't really operate as representational paintings, in the sense that they're not organized in order to look like a visual field, landscapes, those sort of things. But for all intents and purposes, it functions as a flat surface, as a map, or as a target, or as a flag. And in doing so, he kind of confuses the whole representation, abstraction dichotomy. Does that make sense? How I guess they're representational. They're full of associations, but they are embracing the flatness of the canvas and not using it as a window. Anyway, I just wanted to connect up to that because you've already seen it. Yeah.
What are Jasper Johns and Rauschenberg considered?
Oh yeah, I wanted to say that. So we've been talking about abstract expressionism, this sort of ism that we put over a group of artists. And we've been talking about minimalism, and we have a couple more isms to talk through, and eventually you'll find that in this class the isms just start falling apart, and we'll start operating without isms, because who knows what to call this stuff. With these guys, Johns, Rauschenberg, Cage, it's a little bit tricky to name them. Usually what you'll see them referred to is either Neo-Dada, which just means new Dada, and what they have in mind in naming Rauschenberg Neo-Dada is Duchamp. It's new Duchamp, right? So sometimes they're referred to as Neo-Dada, or sometimes they're referred to as proto-pop, which means what we're going to talk about this afternoon, pop art. This is really anticipating what pop art is going to do. So sometimes they're called proto-pop, and sometimes they're called other things, but those are the two most common, which is sort of a not like they don't get a name. You know, you're like this and like this, but you're not quite either. I don't know. Neo-Dada, proto-pop. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Cage is often referred to in music theory and music history as a minimalist, but that's sort of confusing in terms of the visual art field, because minimalism in music is doing something a little bit different than minimalism in the visual arts. Other minimalist musicians who would be really influenced by Cage would be people like William Duckworth and Philip Glass, that were interested in minimal composition. Anyway, sometimes he's referred to as a minimalist, but don't get too confused with that and think of cubes and things like that we think of in art. And I wanted to give you just a couple of other artists that you can, if you're interested in Rauschenberg and Johns, a few other artists you can look up who are doing related things. Louise Nevelson, and I'm specifically showing you stuff that you saw at MoCA. You saw, I believe it was this work. And once again, she's making kind of minimal forms with minimal color, I suppose, but it's all made out of discarded objects from primarily domestic spaces, homes, legs of furniture, and frames of seats, and those sort of things. So it's a kind of minimal aesthetic and object, a formalist thing, but it's already loaded up with associations from the lives that we lead and those sort of things. So Nevelson, another artist that a sculptor that you can put in that category is a guy named John Chamberlain, who is often referred to as a junk sculptor. And there's a whole kind of movement of junk sculpture that is, and I guess Louise Nevelson is sometimes referred to as a junk sculptor as well, but it's using found objects, specifically with Chamberlain, making these formal sculptures. I mean, they're not altogether unlike formalist, minimalist sculpture, except that the materials he chooses to use are all, it's all wreckage from automobiles. They're machines, they're modernist machines that have been wrecked or discarded, and they become twisted tangles of these cars and of these machines. And so what initially appears to be a sort of formalist sculpture actually really has lots of associations, some of which seem tragic, right? Accidents, car accidents, failures, those sort of things. So they become they sort of take apart the formalist project in a lot of ways, or redirect it by introducing lots of associations, some of them tragic, some of them heavy. Okay, so I just wanted to point you off to a few other directions, because our strategy in this class has been and will continue to be to try to get some sense of the landscape of contemporary art, but do so by trying to go in depth with a few select artists, and then you can work outward from those artists. So if you understand what Rauschenberg is doing, you have some footholds and some context for understanding what John Chamberlain is doing, what Nevelson is doing, and so on. Even if they're doing something else, you have to reread them. At least you got some kind of markers in the ground of this landscape of contemporary art. And we're going to do a similar thing with pop art. There are a lot of really fascinating pop artists we could talk about, and they should be talked about, but I'm going to privilege going into depth on one of them and then just pointing you briefly to the others for you to research on your own. And that artist that we'll choose as our representative of pop art is Andy Warhol, the famed or infamous Andy Warhol. And this picture, you can date him. We've been giving general dates to these specific artists. Early 60s is where you can date Warhol as having the first real significant impact. Early 60s. Specifically, 1962 is even more specific if you want that. And this picture of Warhol kind of sets up our discussion of him in an interesting way, that whoever Warhol is going to be fairly obscured by this work that presents itself as consumer products, consumer packaging. That Warhol is someone who appears in and draws us to re-see and rethink and re-look at consumerism, consumer products, consumer packaging, and the mechanical reproduction that's involved in consumption of these products. So he emerges as this sort of figure lost in them. He's difficult to pin down, and that's already evident in the dates that I give you for his life, because he told all sorts of stories. You never get a straight story from Warhol, and you shouldn't ever believe what he tells you. And you shouldn't ever believe what is written in the statements that I gave you as reading for today. He's one of those people who's always performing, and his performances include the way he talks about his work, the way he makes his work. He's an incredibly elusive figure. So I give you a couple dates for when he's born because he accounts for it differently. There are different stories about his birth and the days of his birth. We think we pretty much nailed it down, but not because of any help from him. So a brief introduction to Warhol, and then we'll kind of sink into the work made right around 1962. He starts in New York. By the way, he's born as Andrew Warhol, and he's born to an immigrant family from Czechoslovakia. It slipped my mind, and I don't have it written down where they're immigrating from. Eastern European country. They are deeply devout Orthodox Christians. Catholic. He's involved in Catholicism later, but I believe it's Orthodoxy that his parents come out of. And they come to the United States, and Warhol grows up as this kind of infamously or famously frail, sort of reserved, shy child who was fairly sick in his younger years. And always sort of a little bit socially awkward, but also very creative and very artistic. And so he really devotes himself to that as time goes on, and becomes very successful early on as a young man as an illustrator for magazines. And so he would illustrate for pretty prominent magazines in New York, like Vogue and Glamour. And he would do illustrations like this, selling shoes, doing advertising in these magazines. And from what I understand, his shoe drawings were some of his favorite illustrations to make. So I show you some of those here. So he's doing this in New York at the time, in the 50s. And eventually, he's also starting a painting practice that gets going, and it's in New York, and so this is in the context of abstract expressionism, once again, and the formalist dialogue. You have people like Rauschenberg and Johns who are starting to make work that is fairly subversive to formalism and abstract expressionism. And Warhol's early paintings that he's exhibiting are doing this as well. Somewhat similarly to John's, he's basically taking structures, sort of formalist structures, compositional structures from pop culture, from popular culture. And that starts initially with those comics. Some of those comics that find their way into Rauschenberg's picture planes. Warhol is just taking and using those as a compositional structure to then paint in. And as he's painting, he includes the dripping, he's painting it sort of rapidly, somewhat like an Abex artist might do. But it's not purely formal, obviously. It is referring to the culture around it, and specifically referring to forms of low culture, like comics and comic books, and so on. In this case, Popeye. And you get, maybe perhaps somewhat similar to Rauschenberg here in this painting, you get this sort of noise or interruption, like two parts of the newspaper are sort of interrupting each other. Two different compositional formats, I guess you could say, that of the crossword puzzle and that of the Popeye comic sort of interrupt each other and are layered on top of each other in this painting. So pretty early on, you get indications of where he is looking for the source of paintings, what he's paying attention to. And this pretty quickly, and I'm jumping over a lot of things to get here, but this pretty quickly leads him to his famous Campbell's Soup cans. And early on, these are paintings with brush on canvas, so he's painting them by hand. And he's painting these cans of Campbell's Soup in a very graphic, kind of illustrational way. And we saw some of these at MoCA, and if you looked at them closely, you can tell they're hand painted, perhaps projected on or traced on. So there's pencil that goes down first, and then he hand paints these things. And so all of them, are sort of these, I suppose, lovingly rendered portraits of Campbell's Soup cans? Why the Campbell's Soup can? What's that? Because it's delicious. Yes. Yeah, that's right. Because it's delicious. I mean, in a way, these are sort of, they're sort of, I guess you could think of them as still life paintings, right? And there's still life paintings in the tradition of like Chardin, who paints his lunch, his sustenance for the day. You know, I mean, those wonderful paintings from the kind of European tradition of the still life painting that meditates on the food for the day, what God has provided for them, what they've been given for the day, their lunch, their food, their sustenance. And in a way, you can kind of link this up to that tradition, and I'm going to continue to link him up to that tradition, and specifically Dutch still life painting. We'll get back to that. So perhaps these are still life paintings of food, of sustenance for the day, sort of lovingly painted. But once he starts putting them together, what happens? I mean, for one, they are also detached from that tradition of Chardin, in that it's a can of soup that you buy in the grocery store is a different way of speaking about your sustenance for the day than, what you've gone out and found and hunted that day and you choose to paint, right? It's this, if it's a still life painting, it soon turns into a kind of landscape painting, and it's a landscape painting of the grocery store, of food, of these meals that is repeated, constructed by machines, canned by machines, and then distributed in mass across the country, so that these lunches or these meals aren't really given to you specifically, but sort of given in a broad, mass-produced kind of way. And once he starts repeating them, in this case, devoting a different painting to a different kind of soup, you get beef stroganoff, you get chicken noodle, clam chowder, and so on, onion soup. You get all of these different flavors, different meals that essentially all look the same, but you get to kind of go through the aisles and you choose which one you want for that day. And that kind of sameness or mass production that has the sense of choice within it is, I think, the kind of landscape he's painting. Any other ways you want to describe what's going on here? All right. Eventually, these individual portraits, and I guess it also changes it depending on how it's displayed. When we saw it at MoCA, it was like a timeline, right? They had organized it so that I think it went in the order that the soup was distributed, that it was manufactured, right? So the earliest Campbell's Soup is tomato. And then the next one is vegetable, and they had this list on the wall of when Campbell's released what soup, and they had it set up in a timeline, sort of documentation of Campbell's own soup production. Here, it goes in that same sort of order, but in this case, it's a grid, and it turns into a sort of stacking, almost like shelves, if you will, shelves at the grocery store that you can choose from. So he eventually goes from these individual portraits, if you will, these individual still life paintings, to single paintings that include stacks and stacks. This time, the cans about life size. The other ones, as you saw from MoCA, are fairly large. I mean, they're like icons, right? It's an icon of a Campbell's Soup can, and that's probably an appropriate way to speak of them. Here they become about life size or so, and they are stacked just as they are in the grocery store. And they keep on coming. Stacks and stacks and repetitions of the soup, more and more of the soup, lots of choices, but there's a sort of uniformity to these that blankets the choices. Or a grid, I suppose the modernist grid becomes a set of commodities, if you will. And so how do we understand these? How do we read these? Well, here's the way Duchamp spoke about these. Remember, Duchamp is important in the early 20th century, but he continues to be alive through this point and is in the United States at this point. And here's what Duchamp says about these. If you take a Campbell's soup can and repeat it 50 times, you're not interested in the retinal image. What interests you is the concept that wants to put 50 Campbell's soup cans on a canvas. If we take Duchamp as a starting point here, then how do we read this? If we're going to interpret this, Duchamp advises us to not just look at Campbell's soup. Okay, he wants us to think about Campbell's soup. What do I think about soup? Duchamp advises us to back up a bit from the retinal image and from the representations or the visual forms that are put there, to back up a bit and to consider the process. What does it mean to reproduce 200 cans of Campbell's soup on a canvas? Why would you do that? What are you after? And notice, Duchamp is pointing us to the concept behind the action, not the image itself. And that is going to be a really important move that will continue after this point. And so how do we read the concept or read this action? Well, one of the ways we can do it is if we look up closely to this painting, one will pretty quickly notice that it's no longer hand-painted like those early ones were, where he's sort of carefully with a brush painting, doing a portrait of these cans. He has, since those early ones and this one within that year, he switched to a way of painting that's called silkscreen printing. Have any of you done silkscreening? Yeah, good, some of you. And what do you do in silkscreening? Rather than using your hand to paint the forms at all, you make one image. And you make one image that goes onto a silk screen. And that image includes blocking out or blocking part of the screen and leaving other parts of the screen open. And so the way you use the screen to make an image is you put it down onto the paper or onto the canvas, you put ink on the screen, and then you take a squeegee and you pull the ink across the screen a few times, and wherever there are open spots on the screen made by a stencil, that it becomes adhered to the screen. Wherever there are open spots, you get whatever color ink you're putting down, which means you make one image and then you reproduce that image an indefinite number of times. It is, in a way, parallel to mechanical reproduction of an image, right? You make one and you reproduce that image indefinitely. And usually you have, for each color, you need a different screen. So you've got a division of labor that occurs, if you will. You've got 3 screens, one for the red, one for the yellow, one for the black. And you've got to get those screens roughly lined up with one another if you're going to get the print to come out right. And if you look closely to this painting, not only is it immediately clear that he's using silkscreen to make these things, but that in the repetition of doing this 200 times, as it happens, those different screens start to kind of misregister, you know? Like the black doesn't quite line up correctly with the yellow or the red, since each of them is put down. So there are these gaps and these sort of misprints that open up with the repetition. So one of the things that we can notice if we take Duchamp's advice in reading this is that the concept behind making 200 cans or 50 on a canvas is that in a way, if you sort of visualize Warhol's process to a very great extent, he's mimicking the process of mechanical reproduction, right? He's making images of cans as a sort of modern landscape, the landscape of the grocery store. He's making a modern landscape painting, color field painting, modernist grid painting, but he's doing so mechanically, by mechanically reproducing it. So not only is he depicting the landscape of the cans in the grocery store, he's mimicking the way they were produced. In other words, mechanically reproducing them. This one, this one, this one, this one, this one. And gone is the individual touch, or the artist's touch to represent each of these. Even if that was sort of cold early on, at least it was a hand paying attention to one thing at a time. Now the thing looks a lot more like a factory. This color I do all at once, and then I go back. There's a sort of division of labor. I do this, and I pass it on to this person, pass it on to this person, and we just do the same thing over and over again, gradually producing something like a canned food. Is that a... Okay. Any questions at this point or comments? Ways you want to clarify that? Yeah.
Oh, just in this piece, are the cans still that life size, or will it be the scale of this?
These are about life size. They might be slightly larger, but they're about life size. So this is a big painting. Yeah. Good question. Yeah.
I just think it's interesting to compare this one to Agnes Martin's paintings.
Yeah.
She was trying to add lightness to the square, where this implies the heaviness of the can, but it's doing the opposite.
Oh, that's nice. Yeah. That's right. And it is the same sort of visual language, or it's related visual language. It's the grid. And there's so many different ways that artists have interpreted and appropriated the grid and how to use the grid. Agnes Martin, it's the grid of this sort of fragile order that somehow underlies the world, or underlies writing, underlies intelligibility. For Warhol, the grid is the grid that undergirds and underlies the production of consumer products. It's the grid that is the most efficient way to organize production, right? And as you said, it becomes a sort of heavy grid, a metal grid, a tin grid. Yeah. Good. Yeah.
It's just interesting because it reminds me of a couple of the quotes that we read in all the Social Manifestos. One where he's talking about how, with communism, they're trying to get everyone to think alike in America. That's already happened. And then that in conjunction with the quote where he's talking about Coke and how anyone can get a Coke, everybody, and there's not a better Coke, everybody in the bottom,
Yes.
Taylor and you can all get the same Coke. And that idea seems by emphasizing the mass production, even with the slight variations of the titles, that
Yep.
the mass production and the, I guess, equality of availability of all these things creates this sort of mono thought in the masses. And I don't know, that's what it seems like.
Yeah. Yes, good. You're putting your finger on the fact that there's a real political dimension to this, and a political dimension to his speech about them. Yes, good. That's right. And actually, I have that specific quote on the next slide, but I have a quote here that I want to read, and then we'll move to that and unpack what you just said, because it's great. You're right on. In one of the interviews that I gave you it's like supplementary material in your readings. One of them is by a guy named Henry Geldsailer. And he says this with regards to these paintings. Pop art, which is what we're going to refer to this, and what is pop art? It's art that is so immersed and embroiled in popular culture. popular culture, the culture of the grocery store, the culture of the television and the magazine. It's pop art. Pop art is a new two-dimensional landscape painting. The artist responding specifically to his visual environment. The artist is looking around and painting what he sees. We live in an urban society, ceaselessly exposed to mass media. Our primary visual data are, for the most part, secondhand, through media, through images, secondhand. It is not then logical that art, or is it not then logical that art be made out of what we see? There's an Ogden Nash quatrain that I feel is apposite here. And it goes like this, a little poem that he quotes. I think that I shall never see a billboard lovely as a tree. Perhaps unless the billboards fall, I'll never see a tree at all. And then Geldzahler says, well, the billboards haven't fallen, and we can no longer paint tree with great contemporary relevance, so we paint billboards. What is Warhol doing, and what are the pop artists doing in ways that do have quite a bit of political and social relevance or critique to them? They're making contemporary landscape paintings, is what they're saying. This is the tradition of landscape painting, and what is my landscape? What is the world that I live in? What is the space that I live in? What is the horizon on which most things that I know and experience appear? The horizon is media and mechanically reproduced media and mechanically reproduced products like the Campbell's Soup can and like television images, which we'll get into here in a bit. And to get back to Candace's quote that she brought up, he starts painting Coke bottles. So Campbell's Soup, Coke bottles, and saying things, as she quoted earlier. What's great about this country is that America started the tradition where the richest consumers buy essentially the same things as the poorest. You can be watching TV and see CocaCola, and you know that the president drinks Coke, Liz Taylor drinks Coke, and just think you can drink Coke too. A Coke is a Coke, and no amount of money can get you a better Coke than the one the bum on the corner is drinking. All the Cokes are the same, and all the Cokes are good. Liz Taylor knows it, the president knows it, the bum knows it, and you know it. And so what's going on? This sort of mechanical reproduction not only sets the landscape, but it also structures much of the way that we think about politics and what fairness is and what equality is. That there's a kind of democracy or democratic program that he's pointing out here, where everyone is equal. You can't possibly buy a better Coke or a worse Coke. They're all equal Cokes. But what is creating that kind of equality, if you will? It's the sameness in the reproduction. It's the sameness in the production, a kind of mechanical sameness that goes throughout all the Cokes, so that the flip side of everyone having an equal Coke is that there's no unique Coke. They become sort of placeless in a way. They're just Cokes that you buy and then you discard once you have enjoyed it, and maybe it makes you happy. What is the most recent Coke advertising campaign? I mean, it's so over the top. It's like pure happiness. What is it? How does it go? They have a tagline. We're sort of running, and it's pure joy, pure happiness, right? Something along those lines. But I don't know. I mean, maybe you can get pure happiness or joy out of Coke, but there's also something so uniform and non-distinct about from one Coke to the next that the kind of experience of them becomes uniform and expected and so on. And so he'll pick up all of these various things that are mechanically reproduced. He's really quite consistent in what he chooses to paint, what he chooses as his landscape. And generally, it's a printing press or a factory process.
I found the Coke slogans, like,
The most recent one.
the most recent three, okay, from 2009 was Open Happiness, 2010 was The Capture Refreshment, 2011 Life Begins Here.
Yes. So the first one was Open Happiness?
It goes all the way back to 1886.
Ooh.
So let me see, in the 60s,
Coke after Coke after Coke.
Oh, that's Warholian, isn't it?
1966 is, when was the...
62.
Well, 59 was Be Really Refreshed, 1963 was Things Go Better with Coke, and then 66 was Coke after Coke after Coke.
Yes. Wow, that's a sort of dark appropriation of Warhol, isn't it? Coke after Coke after Coke. And now we're to the point where we open happiness and the beginning of life starts here. Yeah, life begins here.
So that description kind of had almost like a socialist edge to it.
Yes.
It's the same for everybody. Everybody
Yes.
you know?
Yes. Yes, and he makes that point exactly in one of the readings that I gave you, where he pulls together. I don't know if I'll be able to find it off the top of my head. Oh, here it is. Someone said Brecht wanted everybody to think alike. I want everyone to think alike. But Brecht wanted to do it through communism, in a way. Russia is doing it under government, and by Russia he means the USSR, the Soviet Socialist Republic, Soviet Union. It's happening here all by itself without being under a strict government. So if it's working without trying, why can't it work without being communist? Everybody looks alike and acts alike, and we're getting more and more that way. I think everybody should be a machine. I think everybody should like everybody. Is that what pop art is all about? Asked the interviewer. Yes, it's liking things. And liking things is like being a machine? The questioner asks. Yes, because you do the same thing every time, you do it over and over again. And that is inflammatory for him to be comparing, which he does several times in his sort of frivolous, sort of dummy kind of way, the way he presents himself. Starts comparing socialism, communism, to capitalist production. That's so inflammatory during this time because this is at the height of the Cold War. I mean, the communists are the evil empire, is what they'll come to be called later on by Reagan. The communists are the evil empire. The United States is standing in opposition to them. We're both arming with nuclear weapons, and we're going to blow each other up at any minute, is what they're thinking. And Warhol is sort of like, in his sort of way, equating the two as creating a similar sort of uniformity just through opposite ends. Now, whatever you might think about that, I think that could, you can't you can't draw too simplistic of a comparison between communism and capitalism. They are inverted forms of each other. The government has a totally different function in either of them. But at least we can take the kind of comment of this sort of tendency that occurs in both to varying degrees, this desire towards an equalization of people. However you go about that, communism and capitalism go about it in very different ways, but both of them have an effect of sort of wanting to perhaps create a uniformity or a similarity in objects, perhaps in people. So, I don't know, make of that what you will. But at any rate, he's picking things that are mechanically reproduced and mass-produced, and he is mimicking the reproduction. And I think that's the best way to understand Warhol, he's a mimic. He mimics this and that. And he mimics specifically cultural products, the production of cultural products. And he does it in painting, and he does it in sculpture. And so far we've seen products, and this might cause some concern with us, these things that we buy and are trained to buy and not really see any kind of, I mean, these are things that I want this, I want a Coke right now, so I go buy a Coke and so on, and I treat these things as resources for me to use when I want them and how I want them. But things start getting fairly dark and more disconcerting in his work once he starts pointing out the way that the human image functions in this system. This system of mechanical reproduction of commodities, things that are made to be consumed when I want them and how I want them. What happens when we run human images of humans, through this system of commodification, as it's often called? And so he takes images, in this case Liz Taylor, who drinks the same Coke as the president and as the bum on the street. Right? Liz Taylor was a sort of glamorous movie star at the time. And he's taking Liz Taylor and repeating her image. But her image has already been repeated multiple times. In fact, where he's getting this image is from one of those reproductions, one of those images that have come out in this magazine or that magazine that has been distributed everywhere, and he happens to get a copy and then just mimics the way that that image went out to begin with. And the most famous of these images, perhaps most well-known, is those of Marilyn Monroe, where he receives from his environment a portrait. He's doing portrait painting. We'll get back to Dutch painting, but essentially you'll start to recognize he's doing still life painting, landscape painting, portrait painting. It's the Dutch it's the Dutch 17th century program. Yeah.
Is he just like editing, like painting over
He's
photographs, or is he actually?
He's silk screening still. So there's a process in silk screening where you can take a photo and transfer the photo to the screen. And so he's doing that. What's it called? I don't know. Photo emulsion. He's using a photo emulsion process, transfer it to the screen, prints this photo, and then is printing 3 or 4 other colors to color the hair, to color the eyeshadow and her eyes, her lips, the background. And because he's got a consistent set of silk screens, he can simply run different colors through it. So you get the same structure that is repeated in a variety of different ways, creating a variety of different moods or sensibilities about it. This, and the colors that he chooses specifically, how would you describe them? Acidic. What's that? Plastic. Ooh, yes. One art critic referred to them as a lipstick and peroxide color palette. And that's about right, huh? It's lipstick and chemically plasticky color palette. And he repeats over and over again, running Marilyn through this grid, through this process. And the image, the photo that he uses is this photo, which is a publicity still for one of the movies that she starred in, called Niagara, from several years earlier. But he's making these paintings in 1962. And 1962 is a significant year with regards to Marilyn Monroe, because she dies in 1962. And she dies in a mysterious, controversial, there's all sorts of controversies still surrounding it that I don't want to go into or care about. But basically, it was ruled a probable suicide. Whether that included overdosing, it was some sort of an overdose. Some people think she was murdered. I don't know. There's all sorts of backdrop about her fling with President Kennedy and so on and so forth. There's all sorts of drama. But at any rate, she is this kind of iconic figure, this beautiful actress who is known primarily for the way that she seduces men on screen, right? She's incredibly seductive and incredibly sexualized, and becomes this sort of icon because of this, and so dies, and it's at that point that Warhol starts painting her and running her through this mechanical reproduction system. So there are really dark undertones to what he's doing. Even though if you read what he says or read interviews about why he's painting Monroe, he's going to keep up the sort of ditzy persona. And we'll talk more about the ditzy persona here in a bit. Tellingly, he paints this painting in '62 also of Marilyn from that same photograph. It's called Gold Marilyn. And how would you describe this painting? It looks like an icon. Why? Yeah, good. Because of the gold, because of the placement. I mean, it's pretty directly borrowing the language of iconography. It is exceedingly flat. It's in the gold. But just as traditional iconography is in the gold and is flattened, stylized. But what's the difference between these two approaches? What does the gold mean in that? Yeah, holiness, the space of immaterial light that traditionally icons and anything that's painted gold in this period is gold because it's supposed to be the space of light, the space of immaterial light. It's the presence of God. It is exceedingly holy and precious and is immaterial. It's the space of God, the presence of God. And the figures are stylized and flattened because they are in that space, if you will. And they're not supposed to be merely regarded as people who are facing off against you or on the other side of a window. They are flattened because you're supposed to read the Madonna and the child and understand what they mean, but also kind of the image withholds itself. It becomes flattened and stylized so that you regard it as more than the image. The image can't contain the Madonna and child. So the image offers it and then also sort of effaces it, if that makes any sense. In this painting, you get this sort of gold that doesn't so much seem to be associated with holiness, and it's certainly not gold leaf and precious the way that is. This seems more like sort of gold spray paint. It's sort of sprayed on. We paint a canvas gold. And then the way that the icon appears, the image of the woman, the Madonna, appears in a flat, stylized way is not because she's in a holy, transcendent realm, but because of what? Yeah.
It looks very cheaply put on, like it's temporary, like they could easily take off that picture, put on another, whatever you do with that.
Yeah. Yeah, good. It seems very temporary and mass-produced. The reason that it looks flat, or the reason we regard it as flat and stylized, is because it's cheap. Because it's all surface. There's no person there. It's only surface. It's a surface image. This is flat and stylized over here because the figure is more than the image. The reality of the image is more than the image it outstrips it. This sort of reduces itself to only surface and only image. That's a painful comparison, isn't it? But she's dead. She's a sort of saint. He's sainting her in a way and painting icons to her, but it's an icon that's her image, her surface. And as he continues to produce these, they become more mechanical and more colorful and more kind of surfacey, empty. And he says this about the process that he's using here. Somebody should be able to do all my paintings for me. The reason I'm painting this way is that I want to be like a machine. I think it would be terrific if everybody was alike. I think everybody should be a machine, language that we've heard before in different contexts. He's mimicking a machine-like handling of this image that once again becomes increasingly surface-oriented. There's less and less of a person there and more of an image, a surface. He says this, I don't feel like I'm representing the main sex symbols of our time in some of my pictures, such as Marilyn Monroe or Elizabeth Taylor. I just see Monroe as another person. What a lie. I think it's a purposeful lie. I just see Monroe as another person. As for whether it's symbolical to paint Monroe in such violent colors, it's beauty, and she's beautiful. And if something's beautiful, it's pretty colors, that's all. Or something. There was no profound reason for doing a death series, no victims of their time. There was no reason for doing it at all, just a surface reason. His speech is so haunting because you have to flip it around. You have to read between the lines. That posture that he presents himself in. It's just beautiful. It's just pretty colors. If something's beautiful, it's pretty colors. That's all, or something. There's no reason at all for doing these, just a surface reason. That's what he's exactly right about. It's just a surface reason. And the more he paints her, the more they become sort of surfaces. He paints her lips, which are these she's sort of famous for her seductive lips and smiles, the way she gestures. And so he paints her lips in a kind of way that explicitly dehumanizes her and turns her into these seductively speaking, smiling lips. And this is perhaps what we could call the iconography of consumption. We edit out the stuff we don't want to get the part that we want for whatever reason. And that gives us a sort of flattened world, a world of these signs that signify pleasure or whatever. And there's this repetition in which the things go over and over and over again, and they start to misregister, and they start to sort of be disrupted. There's a problem that enters into the system of this mechanical reproduction. So much so that Jonathan Feinberg calls it's glamour rooted in despair. Oh, it's so painful. And I think the most painful of the images is perhaps this one, where he repeats her not just from canvas to canvas, but once again, all in the same canvas, in the same way that he treated the Campbell's Soup cans. And that equation between the two is, I think, the point in a lot of ways. She's every much a commodity as the can of Campbell's Soup, right? And it's not that she as a person is the commodity, it's her image. It's not that the person, if there's a Norma Jean behind Marilyn Monroe. She's disappeared. She's absent here. What you get is Marilyn Monroe, the image, and she has become an image. And she's an image that is sold and distributed, and there's no person there at all, in a way. There's no person here. It's just surface. And in the repetition, as Jonathan Feinberg calls it, he calls it anesthetizing repetition. That what's anesthesia for? Numbing. And it's a repetition that numbs us. Is the repetition that happens in this image, and it's the repetition that Warhol is mimicking in the repetition and reproduction of her image to begin with. It's anesthetizing. When you repeat something over and 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 over, it empties. And the meaning empties, and it becomes weird, and it becomes disjointed, and it draws attention to itself in a way. And I think that's what he's trying to do. When you get an individual magazine, there's Marilyn Monroe. And we can move on or look at her for a little while and then move on. But when it's the same image over and over, every single page is the same picture, the thing sort of becomes weird, and you are sort of drawn, your attention is drawn to the repetition itself, and it becomes just repetition and just image and just surface. And in this one, which is a diptych, you get on one side the color, on one side the black and white structure without the colors inside, and it seems to break down. It seems to, there's a problem with the printing. It runs out of ink, or it's over-inked. Drawing attention, once again, to the repetition itself, to the image making itself. And he says this in one of his more poignant phrases, I think, or quotes. This is Warhol. He says this: "The more you look at the same exact thing, the more the meaning goes away, and the better and emptier you feel." If that's not anesthetizing repetition, I don't know what is. And he goes on, a few other quotes from him. "I see everything this way, the surface of things, a kind of mental braille. I just pass my hands over the surface of things." And that's right, it's surfaces that he gives us. Surfaces without people underneath them. This has been called, I had a professor in graduate school, Dr. Kleinfelter, who is one of the best teachers I've had the pleasure to work with, referred to this as, in one way or another, it becomes a kind of sublime. The sublime, where that which you're picturing becomes out of reach and somehow simultaneously beautiful and terrifying because you can't locate what you're trying to talk about. The sublime, we talked about that with Rothko. But she referred to this as the Xeroxed sublime. That which becomes sublime because it becomes inaccessible by way of its repetition and its surface, its impenetrable surface. Is this kind of making sense? Any comments? Anything you want to add to this? Ways you're reading this? Yeah, go ahead.
It's not a very half-baked thought. It's just interesting, like it seems like you could almost replace, in a lot of what he says, you could almost replace you with I. Like it's like all of his responses are more of a social commentary on what his pictures are actually doing.
Yeah,
And
yes.
that's, I don't know, that's just interesting.
Yes.
And that idea of repetition.
In a lot of ways, he plays the consumer of his own images, and certainly the consumer of the products themselves. That he kind of repositions the artist to just be, he repositions himself to be the receptor surface. Rauschenberg still is using the painting, the canvas, as the receptor surface. Here, Warhol becomes the receptor surface. He becomes an empty person who just repeats what he's been given. He repeats his landscape. And all of his comments are a sort of a repetition. He becomes the receptor surface. I think that's a great way of thinking about him. And I want to talk real briefly about that, who he is, and how we should regard him. To give you another quote from him, he says this: "If you want to know all about Andy Warhol, just look at the surface. Look at the surface of my paintings and my films and me, and there I am. There's nothing behind it. It's just surface." Okay, let's see if we agree with him, and try to get a sense of who he is. And I want to show you a couple of videos of his interviews, and we'll see. We'll get a sense for how he presents himself. He referred to his studio as the factory. Of course, that's exactly what it's doing. He's mimicking a factory. And so he covers all of the walls and all of the surfaces with tinfoil so that it's more factory-like. And his factory was crazy. It was a crazy place. There were people in it all the time, and there were parties in it all the time. It was just a wild place. And he's got several assistants that are making these paintings, because why should he make them? I mean, it's not about his hand or his touch anyway. It's about mechanical reproduction. So here's the factory. And here are a few interviews I want to play of him, and see if we can get a sense of how he presents himself. What is he doing with his speech? Okay, so how would you describe his persona? This persona that he's putting forward?
It's very non-committal.
Non-committal, right? He's not committed to much of anything. Good. What else?
Well, he kept on talking about wanting to be a robot and wanting to be a machine, and it is very almost like mechanic, to a humoristic.
Yeah.
His expression is so yeah.
Disinterested.
Yeah.
Right.
I found it really funny in the first interview when he asked him before you did silkscreen and then you did something else. He basically repeated the question back to him backwards.
Yeah. Yes. Good. Yeah, that's right. So first, and you could see his wheels turning if you could see it. He's thinking, okay, if this guy isn't going to give me answers, how do I make him give me the answers? Well, I repeat his questions back to him. I answer them without saying anything other than what he's already said. So you made silk screens. Yeah, so first I made silk screens. And then eventually just starts parroting the words he's saying. And then and then I made some. Yeah, so he is kind of playing this empty person who is needs, maybe we say it this way, that he needs input to give him output. He needs to consume something in order to think something. That's the role he's playing, the sort of empty-headed consumer. I think what he's doing. Did you have a follow-up to that?
How did he die? 'Cause it seems like somebody would have shot him.
Well, someone did shoot him. One person in his factory, one of his groupies, who was mentally unstable and kind of obsessed with him, showed up in his studio one day and shot him a few times, and he almost died from it. That was in, off the top of my head, 69. What's that?
I was going to say 63, because he said it was right after Kennedy got shot.
Right before.
Oh, is it? Is it that early? Okay. Yeah, no, that's right. Yeah, that's right. It was fairly early on. So he was shot. He had all of these surgeries, and he's got all these wild scars, or had these wild scars. There's a famous photograph from who? Richard Avedon, I think, of his scars. But he ended up living till 1987, and died then of natural causes, I think. But that's interesting that you mentioned that. Yes, he did die. Or, I mean, he was shot. Real quickly, I want to, there's too much to talk about. Skim over a couple of things. First, go look up these on your own if you're interested. The screen tests. I mean, he's so consistent in what he does that he plays this sort of knuckle-headed, empty-headed fool. But the work is so consistently talking about the same things over and over again. The screen tests are where he had these people that were in his studio, that would come to the studio, who had what he called a star quality, sit in front of a running film camera, and Warhol became very interested in film. Of course, he has to, if he's mimicking production. He became very interested in film, and so he would sit down these people with star quality in front of a camera, and he would say, these are screen tests. I just want you to sit as still as you can, and the camera will run for 2.5 minutes. And 2.5 minutes is a long time in front of a camera. It's at least just long enough that the people would start sort of posing. I'm cool, I'm glamorous. And then eventually start to squirm. And the smile would kind of have to break, because you can't hold it for that long. Or if you do, it feels awfully artificial. And you start to sort of break apart and break down and squirm and become really uncomfortable with this staring camera, the camera that won't blink. It just keeps staring at you. And you can't hold your glamour that long. They are haunting little images, little films, 2.5 minutes each. And when he exhibits them, he strings them together. In '63, he starts painting what he calls the disaster series, the death and disaster series, where he takes images of horrible car crashes from, if not from news, from police archives, and repeats them multiple times. And that anesthetizing repetition becomes even more haunting and troubling. And in light of these, you start to see I am totally numb to the tragedy on the news. It's just more death and destruction, which I think is probably where he gets the title for these. And he says this, when you see a gruesome picture over and over again, it doesn't really have any effect. And that's right. These are the dismantling and destruction of lives that we become kind of numb to. So I don't know, though, if we become numb. There's something about when he limits them to 2, where if it's one image, it's awful. When it's 2 images, it's an image. It's a repetition. It's a portion of a film strip. But there are only 2, so you're drawn into the horrible quality of the images, especially this one that is an ambulance that got into a wreck. This vehicle for rescue and for redemption of broken bodies is enfolded into the brokenness itself. And those earlier lines that Warhol had about the more you look at the exact same thing, the more meaning goes away, the better and emptier you feel, become darker and darker in these series of paintings. And I think we see in Warhol's work an ongoing preoccupation with death, and with a concern for other people, and with our own fragility and mortality. This is one of the ways he chooses to portray himself. And I argued, and I want to argue this really quickly in the minutes that are left. I argued, how do we understand Warhol? What is Warhol doing? And I want to offer the thesis that he's essentially a mid-20th century Vanitas painter. What's Vanitas painting? For those of you who've taken some art history and know something about it, Vanitas painting comes out of the 17th century Dutch tradition. So it's Calvinist painting. It's Reformed painters who are steered away from representing images of the saints, Mary, Jesus. Those are too problematic for Calvin, and so Calvinist painters refrain from painting religious subject matter. So they figure out other ways of painting religiously about images, about the world around them in non-religious images. And one of the ways they do that is to meditate on life, human life in relationship to God and to nature. And one of the things that they point out fairly strongly in Vanitas painting is that everything is a gift of God, everything is God-given, but there's dysfunction that has inhabited the system and invaded the system. And it's invaded our knowledge, it's invaded our writing, our communication, it's invaded our understanding, snuffed out candles, that these heads, these human heads that try to manage the world and account for the world ultimately die and decay, those heads. And so Vanitas painting is this extended meditation on the vanities of human existence in the context of the grace of God. That's always there. So like in this painting from that tradition, you get this wonderful, lush heap of fruit and flowers, all things that are good and pleasing to the senses, good for food and pleasing to the eyes, perhaps as it says in Genesis 2, Genesis 1. No, that's 2. I gotta go on, we're out of time. So these wonderful things that in Dutch painting are regarded as the gifts of God, evidence of God's grace in the world. All of this has been given, and it's been given as good and as pleasing to the senses. But always in Dutch Vanitas painting, you have the kind of evidence of decay, that what God has given has also been subjected to sin and subjected to futility. And so the ants emerge, and decay starts to set into the fruit. Things start to rot. And so there's this implication that, not implication, direct statement that your senses encounter the gifts of God and what has been given by God, but be careful you don't invest yourself in them, because if you invest yourself in the pursuit of that which is pleasurable, you will end with nothing. You have to regard them as the gifts of God, and they're pleasant, but if you invest yourself into that, you invest yourself into something that's failing and futile and decay, subject to decay. And Vanitas painters would turn this towards wealth, the pleasures of wealth, not just the pleasures of food and visual pleasures. They would turn it towards the arts, that the arts themselves and culture in general, cultural production in general, is good and given by God, and it mediates the grace of God, but it's also subjected to futility and thus in danger of radical vanity, human vanity, to inhabit it and to take over in it. In that context, I want to put forward the suggestion that we can understand Warhol as essentially 20th century Vanitas painter. That he's making landscapes, still lifes, and portraits, which are the 3 primary subjects of Dutch painting. But he's doing so all in ways that those things have been occupied by and taken over by mechanically reproduced consumer culture. And he's not, I don't think, decrying capitalism specifically, or the market, or the availability of all of these wonderful gifts and wonderful riches that go along with capitalism, but that there are sources for pretty radical vanity within them. And if you invest yourself in those things, in the pursuit of those things, you can reach awfully dehumanizing ends. That's a thesis that I wish we had a little bit more time to work out. And I also wish we had a little bit more time to work out Warhol's relationship to religion specifically, to Christianity specifically. His mother, he lived with his mother until she died. I mean, this is like a major artist who lives with his very elderly, extremely devout Christian mother. And there are all of these stories that came out after Warhol died from the people who were close to him, and there weren't very many people who were close to him. He was always surrounded by people, but no one was very close to him because he was always performing. But there are these stories that come out after he died that are saying, oh, he attended Mass almost every day, and he volunteered in the soup kitchen at his church, and he remained fairly devout to the end of his life. Now that can be metered against a whole lot of other suggestions, and it's a really complicated relationship between Warhol and Christianity, but it's really strongly there, and that link between perhaps Protestant vanitas painting, the Catholic visual traditions, and consumer culture, I think he is operating where those things intersect. If you're interested in that, there's a book called The Religious Paintings of Andy Warhol or something like that. You can look that up more, and there are more things written here and there. We're out of time, but I'll take your question.
It almost just seems like the persona he puts on and the way he lived gave himself permission to hide and kind of contemplate everything he was watching, because it seems like the person he was kind of like a dog. He could look through the eyes of that,
Yeah.
and be amused, and
Yeah.
try to understand it himself. Unlike a lot of other artists, it seems like he didn't pour his soul out of the canvas.
Yes. In fact, it really is the case that there's no, I mean, Warhol isn't pouring any soul into his canvas or his art. It's all sort of a distant performance, if you will. And that's some of what people say about him, is that his factory, his studio, was crazy. I mean, there were people doing all sorts of things in his studio, doing drugs, doing all sorts of things, and they would just say, what Warhol did is not participate, he just watched. He was always watching. He sort of watched everything and refiltered it, sent it back. That's what, whatever you think about that. He's an interesting character, one that needs more thought and more discussion, but we're out of time.
Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Visit biola.edu to find out how Biola could make a difference in your life.